Today's scripture reading is from John 20:24 through 29. One of the 12 disciples, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, was not with the others when Jesus came. They told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he replied, "I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hands, put my fingers into them, and place my hand into the wound in his side." 8 days later, the disciples were together again, and this time Thomas was with them. The doors were locked, but suddenly, as before, Jesus was standing among them. "Peace be with you," he said. Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and look at my hands. Put your hand into the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe." "My Lord and my God," Thomas exclaimed. Then Jesus told him, "You believe because you have seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me."
Okay, good morning, everybody. This is week 5 in a series I'm calling Your Move. We'll finish this series up next week, and then the following week, as Sarah Beth said, we're going to have a very important kind of update about our whole building process. So just to reiterate that, be here if you're going to be in town and you can make it happen. I'm going to not answer all the questions, but I'll answer quite a few, so it'll be an exciting morning. What I've been doing in this series, this is the Easter season in the church calendar. So this is the season when, Jesus rises from the dead, and then in the gospel accounts, he's like showing up places, on the beach and, in this upper room with the Thomas episode that you just heard a second ago. And everybody's, trying to figure out, what does it mean that this guy who we knew and lived with, he died, we watched him die, we buried him, and now he's back from the dead. Like, what's the significance of that? And so I've just been answering that question, but trying to frame it for us in a way that, I don't know if you've thought about it this way before, but thinking of the Easter season as like the return to the Garden of Eden. So this big complicated book begins with these two humans, Adam and Eve, and they're in this garden, and they're faced with a choice, and the choice is between two trees, what's called the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The story is really about how human beings construct meaning. Like, how do you make a meaningful human experience? And the choice is between you either build meaning off of this sort of God foundation, or you try to construct it on your own, out of nothing. And I'm trying to get us to think about the Easter season as kind of a return to that place with an opportunity to make that same choice. So this is why we did the imagery this way. Think of the cross like the new tree of life, and every person is in this place. Because of what Jesus did, am I going to construct my life around the meaningfulness or the logic of the cross, or am I going to try to make sense of my life in some other way, according to some other logic? Okay, so if the cross was God's move in response to sin and evil and death, now it's your move. It's my move. It's my opportunity to say, okay, am I going to organize my life according to the logic of the cross or in some other way? Now, on the surface, I've said this every week, this should strike us as the easiest decision in the history of decisions. Right? If the logic of the cross is self-giving, self-emptying, other-centered love, most people are going to look at that and go, well, yeah. I mean, if you were taking a test, and the question were, based on what principle are you going to organize your life? And the options were sex, money, power, other-centered, self-giving love. You're a total cretin if you choose anything other than D. But most people don't. I mean, that's what I'm trying to poke at in this series is, even on the surface when we go, yeah, self-sacrificial, other-centered love seems to be the way that I'm supposed to construct a meaningful human existence, and yet on sort of a daily basis, there are a lot of reasons why we don't. Even people who profess to want to, like me. I mean, I'm being honest about my own life. And there are a lot of reasons for it. We've explored some already. Some people haven't heard the Jesus story, so they just don't have the option to do that, at least not intentionally. Some people have heard the wrong story. There are a lot of ways of being taught or told about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection that don't actually require you to reconstruct the meaning of what it means to be human. Some people rightly recognize it's a difficult story. Right? Self-giving, other-centered love looks good, on this level when it's, well, yeah, I'll do that with my spouse and my kids and my friends and people that I like, but Jesus says, no, you're going to all the way down, which means you're going to do this even with your enemies, even with people who hate you and wish you harm. Well, that's much more difficult to do, and a lot of us don't want to do that, or we're not able to do that. Last week I talked about it's not just that they haven't heard the story, they've heard the wrong story, or they've heard a difficult story. Some people have only ever heard a story, meaning Christianity for them is just that. It's just a story. It's just a tale. It's just a testimony, and it hasn't been matched or combined with some kind of personal experience. Like you've never had an actual encounter that you would consider to be an encounter with the risen Jesus. And if you don't have a personal experience, especially in today's culture, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this today, it's easy to disbelieve. I mean, everybody in the Gospels who met the risen Jesus, who encountered him, they believed. But everybody who only heard a story or only heard the testimony that he had risen, at least initially, they didn't believe. Okay, so I want to sort of build on that today. Here's the question. If personal spiritual experience is so important, and as I said it was last week, I spent a whole week arguing personal spiritual experience is pretty important. Actually, I did an entire series on that topic last year, right? Called Experiencing God. If experiencing God is so important to cultivating religious belief, then in the story I shared with you last week, when Jesus actually encounters his 11 disciples who up to that point had chosen to disbelieve, right? Just based on the testimony they heard, why does Jesus rebuke them for that? So just to recall that story from last week, Mark 16, Jesus appears to a woman named Mary Magdalene, and she believes in him, and immediately she turns around and she goes off to tell the other 11 disciples. And then Jesus appears to these two other disciples who are walking on a road from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and they, of course, believe in him, and they do the same thing. They turn around, they run off to tell the other 11 disciples. But that story in Mark 16 says that in both cases, when Mary Magdalene and when these two disciples show up and they tell the other disciples, we've seen the Lord, just like happens with Thomas in this story you heard a moment ago, the other 11 disciples, they don't believe. Now, later in the story, Jesus finally shows up to see them. But if personal spiritual experience is so important and so necessary, then you would think when Jesus walks in the door, he would say, or comes through the wall, or however he got in there, he would look at them and say, hey, no worries, fellas. I get it. Yeah, it's pretty incredible. I understand. To be honest, I probably wouldn't have believed him either. But hey, I'm here now, and so you can believe too. But that's not what he says. He rebukes them. He does something similar with Thomas here, right? He says, quit being faithless. Believe. So what's up with that? It's almost like Jesus is saying, you should have believed based on what they told you. And he makes it even more explicit here when he says to Thomas, you believe because you've seen, blessed are those who will believe who haven't seen. So if personal spiritual encounter experience is so important, then why does Jesus rebuke people for not believing in him based on the testimony of others? One piece of evidence or sort of breadcrumb to help answer that question is, at least in the Mark 16 story, and you get it here in this Thomas account as well, it says that their unbelief was stubborn. That it had stubborn unbelief. I know most of you don't have any experience with stubbornness, but here's what it is. The Greek word in this passage is sclerocardia. Sclero, hard, cardia, heart. Hard heart or hard-hearted. So it gets translated in English as stubborn, but the actual word means hard-hearted. And you ask, well, what does hard-hearted mean? That's not a phrase we use very often. That word, that phrase, only gets used by Jesus one other time. So in all four Gospels, it's in that story in Mark 16, and it's in one other story. A group of religious leaders, they come to Jesus, all male religious leaders in his day, and they come to him and they say, Jesus, we have a question for you. And it's a trap, right? They're trying to, they're trying to trap him. They say, we got a question for you. Are we allowed to divorce our wives for any reason? And Jesus, he doesn't have to think very hard about it, and he says, no, that's not what God designed for marriage. And they say, oh, okay. And I think they were expecting that. I think they were expecting him to answer that way. And he says, well, then riddle me this, Jesus. Tell me why then does our Bible, and it does, why does our Bible, if I just open it to right here, why does it say that I'm allowed to send my wife away? This was a one-directional thing. Sorry, gals. Why am I allowed to send my wife away for any reason as long as I draw up a certificate of divorce? So as long as the paperwork is in order, why does the Bible say that I'm allowed to do that? And Jesus' response was, and this makes sense when you understand the context, he says, Moses gave you that command as a concession. And it was a concession, he says, because you were hard-hearted. So in the context, in that patriarchal, male-dominated world, a woman's well-being, her ability to flourish in life was almost always tied monetarily to a man's. So if a husband decided to just dismiss his wife and send her away, okay, that was a very vulnerable place for her in that context. Okay? So essentially what Jesus is saying, Moses knew you were going to do that anyway. He knew that you had absolutely no interest or desire or intention to do with regard to marriage what God actually wants you to do with regard to marriage. So what I'm going to make you do is I'm going to make you go on public record. If you're going to send her away, you have to go on public record as to why. Because if you don't, then everybody's going to assume the worst. And of course, they're going to assume that she was unfaithful. And if there's no public documentation to the contrary, then she's basically untouchable. Nobody will marry her, and she will be in a very, very bad place. So if, you're going to be a jerk, and you're going to dismiss her because of whatever, pick your stereotypical superficial reason, and you're going to send her away, you got to document that. You got to go on record, so you sound stupid, right? I sent her away because whatever, right? Pick your just ridiculous thing. Fine. You got to go on record so that everybody knows. It was a way to protect women because men suck. Right? Like they are hard-hearted. In context, hard-hearted means you have no intention of doing the right thing. It isn't that you can't, it's that you don't want to. It is a stubborn refusal to do what is right. So in that context, stubborn refusal to do what is right. In this context, stubborn refusal to believe. It's not that you can't believe. It's not that it's conceptually too difficult. Remember, religious belief is not propositional. That doesn't mean propositions are not a part of religious thinking. It's just religious belief is not if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. That is not what it means to be a religious thinker. You can evaluate that statement for its truthfulness, its objective truthfulness. Religious thinking is more like trusting something. It's living within a whole kind of framework of reality. So when that Mark 16 story says that they stubbornly refused to believe, it is not saying they found the prospect of Jesus rising from the dead conceptually difficult. It is obviously conceptually difficult. You and I have never physically watched it happen. So conceptually it's difficult, but that's not what it means. What it means is they're not going to. They have decided ahead of time, I refuse to trust what you're saying. And Thomas has become, probably wrongfully so, Thomas has become a sort of poster child for this kind of thing. Today, like in our world, hard-heartedness, probably the closest that we have, synonym is cynicism. Right? When you use the word cynicism or a cynic or to be cynical, it means something like skeptical, but it's more than that. Like if you know anything about cynicism, what we call cynicism today has its historic roots in a Greek philosophy by that name. It was called cynicism from the person who started it. What you may not know is that the original cynics, and I don't think this is true today, but the original cynics, what they cared most about was living a virtuous life. So from their perspective, for you to be happy, The Greek word is eudaimonia, flourishing, not I'm having an ice cream cone and that makes me happy, meaning like I get up every day and I feel like I'm alive, that I am living a meaningful, significant, rooted, abundant existence. I'm not just breathing, I'm living. Okay, that's eudaimonia, happiness, flourishing. From a cynic's perspective, to live that kind of life, and nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I don't want that. Everybody wants that. That is what we are all running after every single day. The cynic would say, you cannot have that if you are not a virtuous person. Central to living a flourishing life is to be a virtuous person. Now, and I tip my hat to them on that score. Now, the way that they thought they got there, and everybody had different schools of thought on how do you do that. Their belief was that the primary reason most people do not live virtuous lives and therefore do not flourish is because of society and its kind of social trappings, social conventions. You're just born into and raised in a world that expects you to do certain things, and that's what prevents you from truly living a virtuous life. And so the way they responded to that was they just stepped back. And they said, we are going to be totally distrustful of society. We are only going to trust ourselves. Cynics were ascetics. They were minimalists. They often deprived themselves of like basic needs, like food and water and clothing. A lot of them lived naked in the streets. That's not virtuous, by the way. But they distrusted society. They distrusted other people. They trusted themselves. That's cynicism. True cynicism is assuming the worst in everyone all the time. I don't trust people or events or things or organizations or institutions. I definitely don't trust leaders, right? It is just looking out into the world and going, I do not trust the testimony of anybody out there. I only trust the testimony in here. That's hard-heartedness, sclerocardia. And Thomas is a bit of a poster child for that. Like he comes right out and says, I will not believe. Not that I can't, I won't. I refuse. Unless certain conditions that I have established are met first. So I am the one who's in control. I've got my criteria. If you satisfy those criteria, I'll be willing to concede, but otherwise, I'm in the driver's seat. That's cynicism. That's hard-heartedness. That's sclerocardia. Now, how does it develop in us? There are other medical conditions that come from the same root, like scleroderma, hardness of skin, sclerosis, hardness of body tissues. And doctors can tell you how those things develop. Where does sclerocardia come from? How do we become cynical, hard-hearted people? Now, I'm no expert on this. This is one of those, like, I just got to review my own life here and hope that maybe it's representative of other people. So when I think about my own sclerocardia, my own hard-heartedness, cynicism, one, I have to admit it's not something I was born with. It is something that I've developed. It's not I recognize some people are born with more skeptical personalities than other people. Certainly there are temperament differences, that's true. But the kind of stubborn refusal to believe that you see in Thomas is not that. It's not just that he's sort of a miser. He's choosing not to trust something. And that is not something we are born with. Anybody with little kids knows you are not born with that. Your kids will believe, for better or worse, your kids will believe everything that you tell them. Everything that you tell them. And you can say, well, yeah, they're kids, they're stupid, they don't know any better. You could also say, no, our most natural way in this world, God-given, imprinted into us, our most natural way in this world is to trust the people around us and to trust what they tell us. That is how we come into the world. It actually takes life and experience to become a hard-hearted person. So I don't think it's something we're born with. I think it's something that we develop, or let me be careful here. It is not something I was born with. It is something I have developed. You can decide if the same is true for you. But for me, it is not something I was born with. It is something that I've developed. And it has developed in me because of one of two things, or a combination of the two. One is what I have done, and the other is what has been done to me. What I have done and what has been done to me. When I talk about what I've done, I don't just mean, boy, there's some things in my past that I'm not real proud of, that every once in a while I wake up in a cold sweat, can't believing that I actually said or did that, and I have guilt and shame for those things. That is true. You all have that as well. That's not what I'm talking about. That's not unimportant. That's not exactly what I'm talking about. Stubborn unbelief in my life comes from the fact that I choose a course of action for whatever the reason I choose it. And once I've chosen it, whether it's a belief, it's a behavior, I have chosen to go down one road. Something happens in me. It's not unlike if you've ever had the experience of being in a junior high or a high school debate class, where a teacher's going to put some kind of ethical topic on the table and split the room into halves, and each half has to take a different side of the debate. But the topic is ridiculous. And one half of the argument is completely and utterly absurd, if not morally unhealthy, right? The teacher says, okay, class, today we're going to debate if Hitler was a villain or a hero. Okay, you guys, you're going to take that he was a hero, And part of you is thinking, I think this is damaging to my soul to have to make this argument. This is not good for me. But because you're forced to take up the position, so for the rest of class, you will passionately and vehemently argue that he was a moral hero, right? Something like that, something similar, like a sunk cost reality happens in my life. I choose a belief, I choose a course of action, I choose a tribe to run with, I choose whatever it is, and I start going down that road. And even if at some point some part of me goes, I don't think this is healthy anymore, right? I think I've walked too far down this road. I think I've started accepting some things that are not true and not healthy for me. This is not leading to flourishing in my life. This is not helping my relationships. I'm not experiencing eudaimonia here. I should stop. I should just be honest about that, and I should backtrack and figure out where I went wrong and go a different direction. It's just really hard for us to do that. There's something in us that once we've committed to a certain way of being in this world, I don't know if it's pride, if it's fear, I don't know what it is, but I won't stop. I won't stop and hit the pause button and go, I was wrong. I was wrong. This made sense to me at first, so I went down this road, but now I'm seeing the fruit of it, and it's not good, and I need to go back the other way. If it's self-justification, but when I choose a course of action or a course of beliefs or a way of being in this world, I get to a certain point where I don't want to have to admit that I was wrong. I don't want to look stupid. I don't want to deal with that. There's too much pride there or whatever. That's one way that I get to stubborn unbelief, a refusal to accept something. It's not an inability. I'm choosing not to because there's cost involved that I don't want to pay. The other side to that, of course, is stuff that's done to me, and I think we can all relate to this. If it's not guilt and shame and pride that gets you, pain will. It will. For those of you that have had experiences in your life where someone, they said they would come home at a certain hour and they just never do. They say that you matter, but they never call. They say that I won't do it again, but they do. They say whatever. You have enough of those experiences, and that is going to calcify over time into a refusal to trust. And that's a self-protection thing. And here's the thing, whether it's stuff I do or stuff that's been done to me, I think if Jesus were to sit with me, I think he would say, Mike, I get it. I get it, man. If I look at some of the things that you've been through or some of the things that have happened to you or some of the things that you've done, and I think he would say the same to you. He would say, I understand. I understand why you go down that road. I get it. But here's the thing. He still rebukes his disciples for it. He does not come to them and say, it's okay. Your cynicism, your stubborn refusal to trust is okay. Keep going with it. Now, Jesus' language of rebuke, like when he looks at Thomas and says, quit being faithless. When he says to those disciples in Mark 16, he rebukes them for their stubborn unbelief. Depending on where you come from, you might hear in Jesus' voice, you might hear that parent or that coach or that boss for whom you were never good enough. You just never measured up. You always blew it. You could never be good enough. That is not Jesus' voice. I think Jesus' voice is something more like, Mike, I get it, man, I get it. But it's still not okay. So that's why I need to address it. I can't let it go. I understand how you got here, but if I don't address this in your life right now in no uncertain terms, it is going to do damage to you. It is not going to lead to flourishing. It's going to harm you, and it's going to harm the people around you. Okay? So you have to face this, and we need to talk about it. You're not a bad person because you got here, but I love you too much to let you keep going down this road. So even though it's understandable how we become cynical people, and in our culture, look, I mean, it makes sense, right? It's really hard to trust in our culture. That's part of what's kind of undoing the fabric of the world in which we live. We're being taught at every turn that you can't trust anything. So I get it. But I think Jesus would still look at us and say, not okay. So you got to deal with it. And when I think about why it's not okay, why is cynicism not okay? Again, not a kind of critical thoughtfulness. But you should ask good questions about the life that you live in and why things are the way they are. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. That's not what this is. This is a total self-reliance, a refusal to place your trust in anyone or anything other than you. Why is that so damaging? Why is it so problematic? Again, I'm no expert here. I'm just evaluating my own life. One thought is that cynicism, sclerocardia, hard-heartedness, it totally undercuts your ability to move or really construct or do anything. Meaning, trust in others and in the world has to be your fundamental disposition in order for you to have anything to build with, to do anything else. Hopefully this will be a helpful illustration. Have you ever wondered why the command to honor your father and mother got into the 10 Commandments? I mean, most of you know the 10 Commandments, at least in theory. If you're like me, you can't recite them unless other people are reciting them. It's like the Pledge of Allegiance. I forget it unless everybody in the room is saying it. But I think in general, most of us are like, I got a rough idea of what the 10 Commandments are, you know. There are some commandments that you're like, okay, you're going to organize all of moral society around 10 rules. Like, what are the 10 rules? This is pretty important. What are the 10 rules going to be? And I get, you need to believe in God and honor God. That one seems to make sense to me. Don't kill people. You know, I get it. That makes sense. Maybe don't steal other people's stuff. That makes sense to me, right? But things like honor your parents. I spent an entire childhood disobeying my parents. I'm fine. I'm just kidding. I was a model child, especially compared to my siblings. But honor your parents. That one gets in there. What if it's generational? Right? Like, what if the command here isn't just, Mike, you really need to obey your parents because, you know, they're smart people. What if it's a generational thing? It is a way of saying, look, every generation has to trust the generation that came before them. If where you begin is a distrust of everyone who came before you, what do you do? How do you even build anything? I get that there is a need, every generation, there is a need to critique the generation that came before you. Every generation has to do that. But you can only do it as an insider. You can only do it as someone who first trusted it and embraced it and was shaped by it. You can't do it as an outsider. The people who critiqued the church in the 1500s were priests, they were monks, they were theologians. They weren't atheists. They had been shaped by it. You know, if I were gonna critique my parents' parenting generation, You know, I have to be honest. I look at my life and I go, oh my God, okay, I haven't seen my kid in a minute. Is he dead? Has he been kidnapped? Has something terrible happened? My parents let me leave for like days at a time and had no idea where I was. I look back at that and go, they were geniuses. Then, there was a part of me that one time I thought, well, that feels negligent, like almost criminally negligent. But it's like, no, they were geniuses. I've got a problem. If I were going to critique something, you can only do it as an insider, as someone who first accepted it, embraced it, trusted it. Because otherwise you have nothing, you have no building blocks. You literally are starting from nothing. You can critique the generations that come before you, but only after you have been thoroughly shaped by them. You got to trust first, right? Take them at their word. Let them grow you and shape you. And then at some point, you can look back and go, okay, what of how I was shaped is good and right and leads to my flourishing? And what is some stuff that I probably need to let go of or rethink? But you can only do that if you trust first. If you don't trust first, you can't even get out of the blocks. You can't even put one foot in front of the other. There's nothing to work with, nothing to push off. It's like trying to move in space. So that's one reason I think trust as a disposition, cynicism as a disposition is fundamentally unhealthy. It naturally leads to a kind of nihilism, meaninglessness. You've got nothing to push against in order to construct a meaningful world. The other reason is I think cynicism is corrosive. It's like rust. It's inherently corrosive and it doesn't know when to quit. Like it will just keep eating and eating and eating everything unless serious remediation is taken. And this is something for me, this is very serious for me, not just as a pastor in general, but of this particular church. Because for those of you who have not been around for very long, we have worked very hard over the years to build a particular kind of church culture here. We are not, on the one hand, a conservative, fundamentalist, evangelical church. That is not who we are. We are, however, also not, on the other hand, a kind of liberal, progressive, mainline Protestant church either. I think the narratives in both of those spaces have been breaking down for people for a very long time. We have really tried to work hard to become the kind of church where when people come in here, a lot of times they are coming in here with sort of the baggage of disenchantment that they're carrying with them from like some of these other spaces. And we've worked very hard to try to create a culture that can help you rethink what it means to be Christian. That you can rebuild something that you feel like is intellectually and morally and psychologically healthy and thick, and you can live in it. The process of doing that, however, it is unnecessary, but it can happen. It can lead to people, if in the process of unlearning something that you were always taught was true, in the process of doing that, you can cop this attitude where like nothing's true. It's all up for grabs. It's all bonkers. I'm not going to trust any of it. And I have watched this happen. It's not necessary, but it happens. It is a risk. And when you go down that road of like just pervasive cynicism, it's like rust. It just keeps eating away at everything until you get to the same place you were before, which is like, I got nothing to push off of anymore now. It's eaten away all the building blocks that I had for making meaning of my life, and now I have nothing. It leads to a total nihilism. Like, I think Jesus looks at us, I think he says, guys, you're my kids, man. I want you to flourish. I want you to be happy. I want you to get up every day, and I want you to feel like you're alive, like you're living deeply rooted, meaningful, purpose-filled lives. That is not going to happen if your fundamental way in this world is cynicism, hard-heartedness, sclerocardia. You have to be willing to trust first, especially the testimony of the church. See, it's not that personal experience isn't vital. It is. I told you that last week. But oftentimes your personal spiritual experience, the reason it is so powerful is because it serves to verify a testimony you have already heard and believed. It's not a replacement for it. It's like I grew up my whole life and all of the wonderful people around me claimed to believe in Jesus and they tried to live virtuous lives and they gave me a particular framework and I accepted it. I believed it. And there were times when I wanted to be cynical about it because I didn't understand it, because I couldn't explain it, because there were things about it that didn't make sense to me. What I did not realize was it was creating for me an entire meaning-making framework. That if it had not been there, if that apparatus had not been there, I would have been forced to make meaningful existence on my own, out of nothing. That would not have been a healthy process. You got to trust first. You got to lean in first. What Jesus says to Thomas is you believe, you're blessed, and you believe because you've seen me, and that's okay. But blessed will be the people who believe that haven't seen me. And I think that's Jesus' way of saying, blessed are the non-cynical. Blessed are the people who are willing to trust first. I understand why you don't. That doesn't mean it's okay. And if you stay there, even if you got there for good reasons, if you stay there, it is going to corrode your life, your relationships, your beliefs. You're going to find yourself feeling like you're anchorless and rudderless, and everything is up to you. I wonder if one of the reasons our world is struggling so much is because they have bought into this narrative of just total and complete self-reliance. And I get it. I think 100 years ago, every teenager, every adult in their world, they would have looked at and said, these adults are virtuous people, and they can be models for me. I can trust them. They're going to show me how to live. That is not the case anymore. If I were giving a commencement speech at a high school and I had to look at a bunch of high school kids, I think I'd have to say, sorry, gang. Sorry. You probably have a lot fewer adults that you can really look up to than maybe people had 100 years ago. So I understand why people get to a place where they don't trust. That doesn't make it okay. It will harm you and it will harm other people. Blessed are the non-cynical. You got to fight the cynicism in your life. You got to fight the skepticism. You got to fight that sclerocardia. And part of how we do that is coming here every week. Right? This communion that we're going to take in just a second, right? The bread that represents Jesus' broken body and the juice that represents his shed blood, that is a reminder to us of who our God is. I say this at every funeral I do. If God is just like Jesus, everyone has reason to hope. There is zero reason for the Christian person to give in to cynicism. There is always hope in God through Christ. We have to be reminded of that, though. You live in a cynical age, and every single day you are tempted to be cynical. The Christian person ultimately has hope. There's hope for us, right? And hope for the world that God so loves. We have to be reminded of that. And we also have to engage in behaviors that shape us, right? This is a participatory sacrament, too. When you take the bread and the juice, you are entering in to Jesus' life. You're not inviting him into your life. He didn't ask you to do that. He invited you to enter into his life. When we take the bread and the juice, that's what we're doing. We're saying yes to Jesus, yes to hope. Blessed are the non-cynical. I'm going to trust. Even if I don't fully understand, I can't explain it, I got questions, I don't get it. I need God and the whole kind of framework that God brings into my world in order to have a meaningful world, a meaningful human experience. So in just a second, I'm going to invite you to come forward. I'll invite you, starting in the back row, you just come down the center aisles. If you've never done this before, our communion tables are here on the sides of the stage. You'll just take a prepackaged communion cup from one of those baskets, take it back to your seat using the side aisle, and then you can take that during this last song as you feel led to do that. But everyone's welcome, right? I want to flourish. I want to be happy. I want you to flourish. I just know in my own life, cynicism is a roadblock. Right? Hope is what leads to flourishing. Let's be hopeful people. I invite you to stand and pray for us, and then come. The table's open. God, we love you. We thank you that you love us, and that is like an anchor for our soul. We can really root ourselves in the fact that you exist, that you create and sustain and redeem us, that you love us. Help us to build on that, to construct a meaningful existence, it just rooted deeply in your love for us and our trust in you. Help us to fight the cynicism in our life. Give us hearts that are soft like flesh and not hard like stones, that we would love you and love others well. we trust you. We entrust ourselves to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
I believe in life eternal. I believe in the virgin birth. I believe in the saints' communion and in your holy church. I believe in the resurrection when Jesus comes again. For I believe in the name of Jesus. We believe in God our Father. We believe in Christ the Son. We believe in the Holy